Okay, this lesson for the Quantity Project class would like to discuss the text in 1 Timothy 6:20. Looks like just the last part. So I'll just say 6:20c, where Paul spoke of the pseudonym of knowledge, and it's in English speaks of science so-called or falsely called. And we'll notice that. Then we'll look at it has the word antithesis in it. We'll look at those anti-positions and contrast those. And then I'll read an article that will show you that something we would not expect from the posturing of modern science as objective and data-driven bias. They have a strong bias as self-evident within it, which is quite a tell to indicate that why we as creationists can know things that modern scientists, the pseudonym of science, that is, the pseudonym of knowledge, that kind of science can't know. So let's just look at it for just a moment and we'll write this out. This is anti, of course. So I'll write anti, and then this is theses. So anti, this is from Tithami, position. So anti-positions. There we go. Taste of the, and then we have this word here, pseudonymu. So of the pseudonym, or the pseudonym, excuse me, pseudonym of knowledge. The pseudonym of knowledge. So we've discussed quite a bit, even the modern trend began in the 90s, I suppose. People like Richard Dawkins, who wrote The God Delusion, just simply said we're apes. And in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, he wrote that as well. That's an identity. So we've discussed the ape identity syndrome, and some of our conclusions from Eddie Johnson and I in our collaboration recently. The identity seems to be very subjective and biased. It corresponds to no known reality. So when I read this, went and looked online and received this AI overview, and it says the failure to distinguish between ontological age, time since formation, and metabolic-biological age-decay, the process of aging, in arguments about the age of the earth is a common source of confusion. Now, this is exactly word for word what Dr. John E. Penn, the late Dr. John E. Penn, retired hermeneutics professor, he developed the historic holistic hermeneutic approach. And this is exactly what he said, almost word for word. And I was thinking as I was reviewing this data that I would have been rushing over, knowing he would be anxious to read it as well. But it says here the ontological, that is time since formation, and metabolic biological age decay, the process of aging, in arguments about the age of the earth is a common source of confusion. This stems from a lack of understanding of the different meanings and implications of these terms. So we have ontological, I'll just put that over here. We have ontological age, there we go, and that's the time of something's formation and how long has it existed, for example. And then we have this metabolic biological age, this metabolic biological age decay, and that refers to the process of decay. So I'll include this in the description. You'd enjoy reading it. So elaboration, ontological age, this refers to the absolute age of something like the earth determined by scientific methods, they say. like radiometric dating. It's the time since the Earth's formation and is a key piece of evidence supporting the vast time scale of geological and biological history. So we'll move to the next. It says metabolic-biological age-decay. This refers to the natural process of decay and aging that occurs in living organisms driven by biochemical processes. It's a concept distinct from the ontological age of the Earth itself. Now, notice that. I'll point out the bias here in a moment and the internal contradiction which artificial intelligence without self-awareness can't notice. So why confusion? Well, conflicting worldviews. Many who hold a young Earth view, around 6,000 years old, often have theological beliefs that align with a literal interpretation of the biblical account of creation, which contradicts the scientific understanding of the Earth's age. Now, notice that here, this article generated by AI just committed the source of confusion to which it has just previously acknowledged, saying that people don't distinguish between the ontological age, the time, you see, the time since formation. So since the Earth came into existence, for example, and then the decay process and the measure of that decay. And now notice it says that a literal understanding of Genesis, seeing it as history, like we see the Gospels as history, contradicts the understanding of the Earth's age. But notice AI did not distinguish that. That's why we have to be patient with such limited things without the knowledge that we have. So it says they may misinterpret or downplay the scientific evidence of an old Earth, often misrepresented as being irrelevant to their beliefs about creation and the origins of life. So even AI seems to have input into it data from which it extrapolated this conversation and this observation and these conclusions in which it now has a dismissive or diminutive view. Well, let's take the opposite here, as I would like to say, the antithesis, and then let's just rewrite that ourselves as I made the note here. Many who hold an old Earth view around 4.5 billion years often have scientific beliefs that align with a literal interpretation of the scientific account of alleged evolution, which contradicts the Bible understanding of the Earth's age. They may misinterpret or downplay the biblical evidence for a young Earth, often misrepresenting it as being irrelevant to their beliefs about evolution and the origins of life. So it would just be as easy as what I just did, just simply rewrote it. But let's start for a minute and come over here. This is the decay side, and this would be ontological. And we had discussed this approximately 6,250 years at 12 hours per day. And we remember the Bible talks about 40 days and 40 nights. We then went and plugged in 6,250 years at 12 hours night. So that's the chronological, ontological. So that gave us approximately 12,500 years. And we have proof here in just a moment that's quite remarkable. 24 hours total. And over here we had the decay, which is asserted as 4.5 billion years. But interesting that you notice the bias here that science doesn't want to distinguish that as decay from this which is chronological. Now that's quite a tell, and it's encouraging if you have dealt with the frustrations of what it's like for someone to teach something, knowing that their audience is assuming that you're only speaking of ontological age, and then knowing that even in this AI overview, the cause and source of that very confusion that has been noted in the article was actually occurred in the article itself. So now it goes on and says a lack of scientific understanding. A significant portion of the population may not fully understand the scientific methods used to determine the Earth's age. Again, this is the second time Earth's age is mentioned without distinguishing metabolic biological age decay from ontological, which were mentioned earlier by the very source that produced this statement right here, such as radiometric dating or the evidence supporting evolutionary theory, which requires a long time frame chronologically, or yes, chronologically, I'm certain, for evolution to occur. Well, there's a problem now because you see what they've done. They noticed that ontological age is quite different from the decay process, and yet they are saying we're codependent upon a long chronological. I'll just put that over here, for example. They need a long chronos, referential time, which did not exist and you go and look in Genesis until the solar system was established, and that would be for us to have times for seasons and day and distinguish day from night. As Jesus said in John 11, there's 12 hours in the day for a man to work. The Bible said in Genesis that it would rain for 40 days and 40 nights, which that 40 days, 40 nights do not equal 80 days. It equals 40 24-hour days. So we have all that. So it goes on and says, a lack of biblical understanding, as I have now made a note of that, rewriting the very thing that AI just said, a significant portion of the population may not fully understand the historic holistic hermeneutic methods used to determine the Earth's age, such as Bible numerics, ratios, instantaneity, or the evidence supporting creation theory, which requires an abridged time frame, requires a very short span of ontological time. And I put in parentheses here, ontologically speaking, for creation to occur. Now, this is where the push comes to shove, and we've got to demonstrate or get to demonstrate how do we prevail this and what would be the proof. So we had 5.5 billion years. We took this, we had the ratio. I'll write the ratio here, the reciprocal ratios, 1 day to 1,000 years. And you've noticed in this lesson so far, those of you paying attention have noticed that science has no way to distinguish between these two, nor a way to show the relationship or correlation between the two. Only the Bible has these reciprocal relationships. 1,000 years to 1 day. And we also have something else, I'll remind you, in Genesis 1:1. Genesis 1:1, the value of pi is there. You remember pi is 3.141592653. And then we also have in John 1:1, these creation texts, John 1:1, we have the number E, which equals 2.71828. Oh my goodness, 1828, which repeats there, 459045, and we're out of room. So we have this advantage over our neighbors, the ones who advocate evolution and what they would call an old Earth. And we now have the concession that they need a lengthy chronological amount of time. So now we took this 12,500, we just moved over here, took 12,500 years, approximately 12,500 years, chronological years. I'll put chronological years, there we go. And we multiplied that by 360-day year. 360 days, which is in a year, and that converts it to the ratio, this day column, and that equaled 4.5 million days. So now you see we can say, what can we know as creationists that evolutionists can't know? And what can we know with science that's not a pseudonym of knowledge, but rather science that's knowledge, similar to the fact that calculus is theological and evolution is not scientific, similar to the fact that calculus was developed by two theologians, Newton and Leibniz, and from that came all that we know today in its applications, such as our technology. So interesting enough, we have data, we'll just compare it. So we had this, and we took this 4.5 million days and we multiplied it using this ratio times 1,000 years, and that equaled 4.5 billion years of this metabolic biological age decay. And I'll just put that metabolic biological age decay. This is exactly what Dr. Penn was saying, and here we now have it produced by an AI overview, which wasn't ongoing at the time, years ago when he first began his research. But now we have this, and we can distinguish this. We are now conceding that this is amount of decay. Science can't say that. They're saying this is ontological. They have to, because if they present this as decay, then how would they distinguish what percent of this number is decay and what percent is chronological, ontologically speaking? Well, we have that as creationists using the Bible data, using the reciprocal ratios, using the inverse relationship between growth and decay rates, which is all this is third grade. There's nothing here. So we now took the 4.5 billion years, this metabolic age, and we were calling it the compounded decay, which is still very much the case, as we'll see in just a moment. Compounded as in the interest rate. You remember that when it was compounded according to the number E. Remember, they don't have that. E's not on their side. E comes from our calculus. E comes from our theology. E and pi, those are all theological terms. Those are theological numbers, the entire Hebrew Bible. So we took this 4.5 billion, these metabolic age decay, and we went this direction and went from years. Now we're going back to days, and we noticed, however, that 1,000 days equaled approximately 2.78 360-day years, chronological years. Notice that. So look what we just found. We just found E, which E proves these reciprocals, and that equaled over here 12.5 billion years of metabolic biologic age decay. Isn't that amazing? Now, I know personally Dr. Penn would just be laughing, knowing, well, that's what I've been saying, and that's why I'm pointing it out and demonstrating in light of the pseudonym of knowledge, which is not knowledge, but we can't know. And if you were to ask, I was trying to do research by those who believe in old Earth chronologically, ontologically speaking. What do you consider the chronological ages? And they just go, well, billions and for one and billions for the other, and they can't sort it out. They have no way to distinguish it. So I went on and noticed that scientific bias motivates the presentation of metabolic biological age. They present it as though it's ontological age, chronological age. The audience wouldn't know better. As Dr. Penn said in point 4 in his historic holistic hermeneutic textbook, define your terms. Well, the audience not prepared to ask the question, just simply would assume, just like we know in our own vernacular, according to our own colloquial expressions, if someone says, how many days are there in a year? We would say, well, there's 365 nights and there's 365 days for a combined total of 365 24-hour day periods. But we don't talk that way. We just say days for everything. We don't distinguish it. But notice this: they they present this metabolic as ontological, as chronological. You all notice and remember that as we studied in these false dichotomies, and we've learned about term switching, where someone says one thing, and then when you begin to evaluate it, well, we mean another thing than that which that says. So in this case, we're saying 4.5 billion chronological years, but that's a result of measuring metabolic biological age decay. Now, it's not a gotcha moment since they're our neighbor and we love them as ourselves, and we're not here to humiliate, diminish, degrade. They have formed an ape identity syndrome, wherein which they speak of primatology. They speak of a no longer existent ancestor from whom they descend, as I did find the humor in thinking they're probably suffering from creator envy. But remember, they don't have the data. They don't have the number E proving that they have knowledge of the reciprocal ratios that alone, those alone uniquely demonstrate the proper relationship between the amount of compounded decay compounded according to E and the chronological years. For example, we could take from Genesis 1:1, go all the way to the end of history, and even where they say the gap is, gap advocates, you remember brother Dr. Penn, that is, talked about Bullinger's blunder, because he said there's no chronological time here between, there is no no chronological time between this Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. Why they wanted it was they needed to insert, ontologically speaking, chronological time there, and that's not there. That judgment that resulted in the waste or void could have been just as instantaneous as Genesis 1:1 in the first place. And the only records we have of anyone having sinned prior to Adam is Lucifer and his judgment. He wasn't at that time cast out of heaven. He was still consigned to the creation. Later, we'll read about when he's cast out from heaven and the war in heaven and all that. That's much later. But for this entire time period, chronologically speaking, we have no need for anything. We have no need for anything greater than 12,500 years ontologically, and or chronologically. There we go. There we go. And that would be approximately, we don't need any more than approximately 6,250 years at 12 hours. Well, my goodness, 12 hours day. And we don't need any more than 6,250 years at 12 hours night. So we have nothing more that needs to be demonstrated for our, let's say, evolutionary advocates of evolution, our neighbors who identify themselves as apes, literally, not that they were once a human that became an ape, but that they are an ape of some kind among the species of apes. That's another issue entirely. But that identity we've just demonstrated is quite subjective and biased. It seems to try to want to make everything fit, because as an ape, you can't then identify and say you have God-given inalienable rights. You can't say that you are an advocate for the freedom of conscious thought and speech, which would be inalienable because those are God-given. You can't say, like the mere humans we are, who believe in God and that we appeal to Him as the source from which we receive our inalienable rights. So let's go on, because we've shown the bias, which is quite a tell. And I'll back over here for a minute. So I've got enough on the board for you to be looking at it. So we can see that we creationists who use the data in the Bible are alone among those in true science, who true science being like the theological fields of calculus developed by Newton and Leibniz, which we've demonstrated calculus is theological, evolution is not scientific. We've also proven it by using the data we have in the Bible. And now we have this bias has shown them, speaking of 4.5 billion years, unwilling in their bias and unwilling to speak because they do not have any precision in any way to distinguish that biological age decay measure from the chronological age. So, as I said to Eddie Johnson, well, you've just proven they can't know the chronology of the earth anyway. They reject the Bible and they don't have an alternative. And yet, when we recognize the Bible and we use the data, third grade arithmetic, nothing of any more demand than what we would have known before we left our elementary schools. But it goes on and says, I'll read again. It says, the biblical ratio between ontological age, time since formation, and the Earth's metabolic biological age decay, which is the process of the Earth's aging, that's proven by the number E. So we're not submitting our opinion from something that they would reduce to say, well, that's just a religious interpretation. No, we're actually saying this is a number in the Bible, in the creation text in John 1:1. We have the number pi in Genesis 1:1, the creation text. We have the 4.5 billion years of metabolic biologic age decay, which is compounded according to E. That's it. It's over. The idea that we'd have to be anyway emotional or reactive against those, our neighbors, who are working without the data we have the advantage of having. So then he goes on and says, misinterpretation of the term age, and this is something Dr. Penn spoke of continuously. You'll need to define your term. So he says the term age can be used in different contexts. It can refer to the duration of existence. We've talked about that. How long has the earth existed, ontologically speaking? As a matter of fact, this past Sunday, I brought a car salesman, not the kind we've had before. We had one we had to prosecute. He was so fraudulent and deceptive. But I brought this very good man, servant in the church, faithful. He's a father to his children, husband to his wife, brother in the covenant. He's exemplary. And he came up and I asked him about a 2024 Chevrolet pickup truck. And I said, both of them are 2024. I used two Chevrolet pickup trucks, same make and model. I said, but one has 300,000 miles on it and one only has 30,000 miles. I said, which one's older? And he said, the best answer, he said, well, I can tell you which one's cheaper. So the point is it's that simple, that we know that something can be worn and have more decay accrued and compounded, and that's the severity of the judgment upon this original creation. And then when Adam sinned, death came into the world, and we do not answer for Adam's sin. We answer for our own sins. Culpability is incurred when we reach the age or the ability to discern between good and evil, and then we causally become culpable by our own actions. We answer for our own sins, not for the sins of Adam. So, as that was sermon was free. So it says here, time of something's existence or the state of decay or change in living things, metabolic biological age. Confusion arises when people conflate these two different meanings. Now notice, AI is now holding people responsible for conflating metabolic biological age decay with ontological age. And yet in this very article, AI did it in the article, committed this conflation. So that's quite remarkable, isn't it? This is something, like I said, had I been able to get this to Brother Penn a few months ago, he'd be laughing and saying, well, I've already said that. I already taught that. That's what I was saying. It's self-evident. So it's been a joy working it out. But it says, now focus on biblical interpretation. Some individuals prioritize their interpretations of the Bible over scientific evidence. We didn't do that. We've acknowledged biological age decay. We've acknowledged ontological age, which we would know about age decay. Remember in Psalm 90, we remember that's the one where we learn. In Psalm 90, we learn that 90% of lifespan was removed from 100% of mankind. We've already talked about how urgent this is, how severe this is. We remember Adam began his life on earth with endless life. Adam sinned, death came in, his life was reduced to 1,000 year span, 1,000 years. He died at 930. And then today, when we get to Psalm 90, we only have that balance of 70 years, and with strength, we might live up to 80. So here we have this. We know about the decay. We know about the earth after the judgment of what happened to Lucifer. We know about the Satan there in the garden, and he deceived Eve, and she persuaded Adam. We know how all this happened. Adam, with eyes wide open, deliberately sinned, and all this is still within a 12,500 year chronological chart that would even include an interval for instantaneity to occur here in judgment. Notice this, in judgment, just as it was in creation. Just as God instantly created Genesis 1:1, this judgment instantly according to instantaneity. And as we know, anything eternal does not incur loss of energy. There was no time that transpired in creation. There's no reason or rationale there. That's why Dr. Penn later in his studies called that Bullinger's blunder, not to diminish E.W. Bullinger, but to indicate that when we assume age between that gap, but don't distinguish between, are we talking about biological age decay or ontological age, we certainly leave ourselves open for quite a bit of criticism. So I can read now about and take the conversely speaking of this slander against those who don't. And he went on and said, they prioritize interpreting the Bible over scientific evidence, leading them to question the validity of radiometric dating. And how dare us do that, since we actually are listening to what they're saying and noticing their contradictions and noticing that their bias is causing them to commit the fallacy called conflating the two different ideas of age. Now, these are both sides of the same coin. There's decay, age on one side, and there's chronological on the other, and one is measured by how many years the rate. So we're dying 10 times faster now because we went from 1,000 years down to 100 years. And that's rather serious because in that psalm it says number our days, but I don't know how to communicate that urgency. I rely on the Holy Spirit to convince people. So I put conversely, some individuals prioritize their interpretations of the science over biblical evidence, leading them to question the validity of ancient historical literature that support the Earth's chronological, that is, ontological age. And we just demonstrated it. He proved it. I don't know who would want to debate a creationist with the information that is so easy to ascertain from the Bible as this is. And like I would say, you may not like answers in Genesis, but you can't debunk them when they speak of the earth ontologically speaking. And you certainly won't find a scientist who wants to bring this up in public, because then he wouldn't be able to, in front of the very audience where he presents himself as one prepared to debate, he couldn't speak of what percentage is decay that you're measuring. And if it's all this is decay, then in what relationship and what rate is it decaying, which you'd have to know the ontological, just like I have to know miles per hour. And when someone's going 30 miles per hour, someone's going 60 miles an hour, the one going 60 miles an hour is not because the miles are shorter. We have to have a constant there, and we do. We have the number E, which proves these reciprocal ratios mathematically and according to that true science, not the pseudonym of knowledge. So lack of education and critical thinking, AI went on to say a lack of scientific literacy and critical thinking skills can contribute to the acceptance of claims that contradict scientific evidence, even in the face of substantial scientific consensus. So I took the converse and said, a lack of biblical literacy and critical thinking skills can contribute to the acceptance of claims that contradict biblical evidence, even in the face of substantial biblical consensus. So it's a touche, but we win because the data speaks. We win because we have the information. We win because we're not raising our voices. We're not thinking ill of our neighbor, the evolutionary activist. We're not speaking against scientific activism that now leads people to identify, appropriate an identity as an ape, which is, I call it, and Dr. Johnson calls it, the ape identity syndrome. And here it is. It's simple. A child could write this, and this is because this is irrefutable. It's unassailable. So we can say we have the ontological age here. We have the metabolic-biological age-decay, both the Earth and the universe, by the way. And we have the reciprocal ratios that were used to calculate this. And we saw the number E emerge to prove the rationale for these ratios. Because you ever wonder, well, where would that, who would know to do that? Who would know to select those ratios? Well, God knew, and the people who, of course, wrote it, and Moses knew of the urgency. So you have a blessed day. Enjoy this lesson, and I'll put this in the description. But help your neighbor and help him understand what he doesn't know, and they can't know it. An evolutionist cannot know at what ratio this 4.5 billion years of metabolic biological age decay occurred. And you as a creationist can, and only you can. So have a blessed day and enjoy this good news and this true knowledge and not the pseudonym of knowledge.